Hello, I am Adeola Adejobi, along with my co-host Jason Clark, and I want to welcome you to Raising the Bar with the MBBA.
The Metropolitan Black Bar Association is the largest association of predominantly African-American attorneys in New York. Our mission is to advance equality in the pursuit of justice, assist in the professional development of our members, and address legal issues affecting New Yorkers. The goal of Raising the Bar with the MBBA is to foster a substantive conversation about justice issues in our community, while also identifying some solutions in the process.
Today, we are going to take a deep dive into sexual harassment in the Me Too era. Joining me now are attorneys Paula, Edgar, and David Mitchell. Welcome.
Hi.
Welcome.
Hi,
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for joining us.
So, first of all, let's start with a couple of just basic questions just to kind of frame the conversation. What is sexual harassment?
So there are two types of sexual harassment. There's quid pro quo, which means this for that. And essentially that's a job benefit that's directly tied to unwanted sexual advances. An employee doesn't have to succumb to those advances in order for that to be sexual harassment, as long as the benefit is tied, whether it's a promotion or an offer of employment. So that's quid pro quo. Mm-hmm. And then there's hostile work environment harassment, where there are, again, unwanted sexual advances from a supervisor, from a coworker, that really make it so that the workplace is untenable and an environment where an employee feels extremely uncomfortable.
In short, it's unwelcome or unwanted sexual conduct in the workplace.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. Good.
And can you give us some background about what's currently happening with sexual harassment prevention in the wake of the Me Too movement?
Sure. The short answer is that sexual harassment and sexual abuse in the workplace is still prevalent. It's in every industry. In the law, in small firms, in small corporations, in nonprofit, in government, it's still pervasive, and it's still something that needs to be addressed. Me Too was the sort of frustrated outcome of people not getting the justice that they needed internally, and bubbled up, and that the wake of that continues to be something that we are addressing, both as attorneys and from what I do in terms of being a consultant.
And yeah, I think it's just been amazing where over these last year or so, there's just been this influx of folks talking about sexual harassment issues. So what do you think has brought this on, and what do you think the next steps are?
Yeah, so sexual harassment isn't new. Obviously, it's been around for some time, but like you said, there's a microscope on these issues now.
Sure.
And so, companies are really, and employers are really trying to make sure that they're generating a positive company culture now, and that's really what it's all about. That's been something that companies have done for some time, but now we're bringing into the fold, making sure that people aren't being harassed, and people aren't even, and that's not just supervisors, that's people at the rank and file part of the company as well. Employees, everybody's involved in making sure that companies are not tolerating this behavior anymore. And I think the reason that it's really been brought on is because, we've seen examples now in the media a lot of where, these big figures have been brought down because of their behavior. And so I think that does give hope to some folks to see that if they were to share their story, maybe they would have a similar result where they would feel justified.
Right.
Okay. To your point about next steps, I think it's that there has been a lack of accountability in the past, and now with there being much more of a focus on getting justice and having people understand their rights within the workplace, there will be more accountability, and people will feel better about speaking up.
Right. Mm-hmm. And so how are employees in New York City protected?
So employees in New York City are protected both on the city level, the state level, and the federal level. We have one of the most comprehensive human rights laws in the nation. And so because of that, we're well protected. There are a lot of venues in which people can utilize in order to get justice, and they don't have to just go internally, they can go externally to one of those agencies as well. So being a New York City resident is a good thing in this sense because of the multiple protections that exist.
Right. And just to follow up on that, since New York seems to be so progressive in this area, it seems like a lot of people don't have that much knowledge about this information. Why do you think that is?
Well, I mean, I think it's about branding, right? Which is another topic I've talked about. It just hasn't been circulated. People don't really think about accessing some of the protections that exist for them until they need it, right? And so I think what's happening now, particularly with the Commission of Human Rights, is they're doing a really good job of showcasing what the protections are affirmatively, as opposed to being responsive, which is what most people, when they access the information, is when something has happened.
Right.
Yeah, and employers are hopefully going to be helping their employees more in this area now, because there have been changes in the wake of the Me Too movement to where trainings are going to have to be more regular, more detailed, and interactive, exactly. So to the point where employees can't kind of just let the knowledge wash over them. They have to kind of process it and understand it and get involved and make sure that they know the company's policies and their protections under the law.
Right. And speaking of trainings, Paula,
Yes.
you do a lot of trainings in this area.
I do.
Can you talk a little bit maybe about some of the things that you talk about?
Sure. To your point earlier about why don't people know their protections, having interactive in-person training allows for people to ask questions that they can't ask to video, right? And so a lot of the questions we ask are, what exactly is sexual harassment? A lot of employees think that it is only the egregious, right? It's only you have been touched or have been assaulted, but there's a lot of gray area in sexual harassment. We're going to talk a little bit about the lines and what the best practices are, but it's basically providing the information about what the coverage is, best practice about interaction, and going through some scenarios to really discuss what you should do, what you shouldn't do, and why, and allow people the space to say, I'm not sure if this was X, or my policy says I should do Y. Should I, and so it's why I really love doing that. It gives people access to the information and helps protect them more in the workplace.
And it can be great to bring in folks from the outside that aren't involved in the company, because these are uncomfortable conversations. And so having this conversation with somebody who you're going to see tomorrow, or you see every day, and you don't want to reveal maybe why you're asking these questions, it can be helpful to have an outside source clean the slate and let you have these difficult combos.
Right. Yeah, because I remember where I work, we had just some general harassment training so that people know exactly what harassment is and when there's an actionable claim. And I know one of the things that was interesting to me is that people's definition of harassment, when you actually looked at the actual examples themselves, some people thought it was some things people thought were harassment, some things people thought weren't. And people have different perceptions, yeah, exactly, of what that would be. So actually going to that point, which I think you were just starting to dip your toe into, Paula, what are some of those gray areas that people don't always necessarily think is sexual harassment and other people do?
So the standard for sexual harassment is looking at it from the perception of the victim, right? And so oftentimes you'll hear folks say, well, that was not my intent, right? My intent was to, we hug people where I'm from. I hear that all the time. But if the victim is experiencing unwanted or unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature, you've hit the standard. Now, whether an investigation will come up to say there's probable cause, which means that essentially proof has been found that something has gone wrong, it depends on what's happening internally within your workplace. But it could be, lots of serial sexual harassers, people who do this often, will breach your space, right? So it won't necessarily be a physical sort of touching immediately, but it will be, I'm getting closer and closer to you without touching you to see how you're going to manage that. They will say things to you. They will talk about things that are not workplace conversations. I say to folks in training, there's no reason for you to talk about sex at work. There's none. Unless you work in a workplace that involves sex, you don't need to talk about it. And so people who will start to breach conversations about what they do or what they shouldn't do or things like that, those you're getting into places that will get you in trouble if you don't think properly about what the lines are within the workplace.
Yeah. And another classic gray area are jokes. Jokes that seem funny to everybody, jokes that are funny to the person delivering the joke. You never know what kind of joke offends somebody. And it's not, again, it's as Paula said, it's not what your perception is or the person who's telling these jokes. What the perception is, it's about how this lands on the ears of others. And it might not even be somebody who speaks out, or it seems like I said, everybody's laughing, everybody's enjoying it. But you never know if there's somebody in the corner, or even somebody who's laughing, who didn't really think it was funny, but didn't want to be ostracized, and just went along with the program.
Or someone who overhears, right?
Right.
Because also someone who is not a direct victim of sexual harassment can also file a claim if they experience it or witness it. So that, it puts you in a tenuous place if you think you and I are having a conversation, we're fine with this content, but someone else in the workplace hears it, you still, again, my point about there's no reason for you to be talking about sex is one that should be heard really clearly. It will help you to stay out of trouble.
Right, and bringing it back to like the victim and the harasser, who can be a harasser and who can be a victim?
So both men and women can be victims and harassers. So men can harass women. The majority of cases are men harassing women. Women can harass men. Women can harass women. Men can harass men. Right. So essentially, anybody can be a victim within the workplace. A coverage in terms of the federal, city, and state laws is consultants, volunteers, interns. Everybody can harass and also be harassed. And so usually a policy will say you're protected from being harassed by these people, and also you can harass those people in those areas.
Right, and even clients, people who you're providing services to their company, they can be harassers to people that work at the company.
Yeah.
So one of the areas, again, even going back to what we were just talking about, some of those gray points. David, you were talking about an example where someone gives a joke and it's an off-color joke. Now, let's say that we're not at the office. Let's say there's a happy hour, and all the folks who are at the office are going to a happy hour. And then maybe some of those same jokes or those same comments, which someone may not necessarily say in the actual office, they're saying at this quasi, non-work environment. When do those things become harassment, and when are they not?
Right. So what is the workplace, right? And that's something that, the laws have been extending where the workplace actually fits for quite some time. So if it's a happy hour where it's a work function and all the people from work are there, that's still the workplace, which is funny to people to think about, but you're still with the same folks, and it's a company-sponsored event. After the official happy hour ends, are you still at the same bar? Are you still with the same people? It really can extend in ways that I think folks don't think about a lot, and it's because people just generally don't know. So hopefully these trainings that the state and the city are requiring will help folks to realize the workplace is really wherever you are with your coworkers. It's hard to really cut that line as to when you're no longer your coworkers and you're just friends or people who know each other hanging out. So you really got to be careful about when you are having conversations with people outside of what you think of as the workplace, because it can extend further than you think.
Yeah, so people should just assume and play it safe and really just don't do any of this behavior at all, really.
Right, but the challenging piece of this is, if you have friends, and most of us will make friends at work, you hang out with people in the workplace, essentially right underneath how much you hang out with your family, right? You spend most of your time with them. If you understand that it is wanted and welcome in terms of your interaction and your connectivity, that's fine. The problem is that people are not self-aware. Right? They don't understand when it's not actually wanted and welcome. And if there is a culture of fear where folks will not want to speak up, it becomes very challenging. So to David's point about the workplace not having walls, if you invite me to your home, right, and we think everything is fine, we're cool, and then I make a pass at you and you don't want that, and you say it and I still do that, I still have breached what is understood in terms of that relationship, because we still have to go back to work and interact. And that is where it becomes challenging.
Yeah, and can you talk about kind of the distinctions within management, for example, right? So with your joke example, let's say the person that told a joke is the boss, and you're like, I don't agree with this, but I feel like I'd have to laugh because I don't want my job to be at stake. Can you talk about that scenario a little bit more?
Sure. Well, people in management and supervisors, they're at an additional risk, right? Because generally, sexual misconduct, sexual harassment is an abuse of power. And so when people are in greater positions of power, they've got to be even more careful about the things they're saying to their subordinates, to their employees who they work with, and to their coworkers, because people might not be willing to share what their actual view is and how things are actually impacting them. And so in trying to create this positive company culture that every company should be striving towards, you should be trying to have open and honest conversations, staying away from these topics that you know aren't appropriate for the workplace, even if you want to build a rapport with people. There's a way to build rapport and to make jokes and to have a good time without straying into these areas that are really just inappropriate and put the company and the person themselves at risk.
Yeah. And so if someone experiences or witnesses this type of sexual harassment, what should they do? What's the process?
So every employer should have a policy that speaks to how someone is supposed to report internally. And so the first thing would be knowing what your company policy is about reporting any allegations of sexual harassment. Once you know that, this is where it becomes a little tricky. An internal investigation or an internal report should happen in terms of the lines that they're laying out. But oftentimes there's not trust that exists, and so employees are afraid of potential retaliation from either the actual perpetrator or from management or from who they report to. And so, the suggestion is to follow what the policy says if you feel safe in doing that. But you don't have to, as an employee here in New York State, have to go internally. You can go externally to one of the agencies we discussed before, city, state, and federal. It doesn't have to be egregious for you to do that. You can just say, I have an allegation of sexual harassment and I don't feel comfortable with reporting internally. Now again, once you do that, it becomes challenging for you to navigate internally, which is why most people will quit and then file a report as opposed to file it while they're still working there. If you do file internally, you go to report to whoever's in the reporting structure. Oftentimes, people will feel more comfortable, though, speaking to a direct manager because they have a relationship. You should know, though, that managers and supervisors under the law are mandated reporters. And so if you go to them and say, I want to tell you this, but don't tell anybody, look, I just want to tell you, they actually, under the law, can't. They have to. They're supposed to report to whatever the structure is within the internal organization. So once you do that, assuming it goes right, there's an investigation that will commence, and how that happens in each workplace is very different. Sometimes it's HR, other times there's someone in EEO, sometimes they will go to an external firm, oftentimes they'll go to a consultant like myself to do external investigations. It really depends. And then they'll interview people, they will look for any data or details that might help see if there's probable cause, and then they'll make a determination. And it can be anything up to and including severance of the workplace for the person who is found guilty or that there's probable cause, or it can be a conversation. They'll ask you what you're looking for in terms of resolution, and it becomes a conversation that continues once the investigation progresses.
So, New York City, melting pot, a lot of different people here. And so there are a lot of immigrants also that work. And I think that, a lot of them sometimes can be afraid to report. So what would be your advice for someone who's an immigrant who has experienced this in the workplace? Yeah,
so you want to, like Paula said, follow the policy, and if you're not comfortable doing that, report outside of the structure. And one thing that companies will do is try to make sure that things are confidential to the extent possible. Any investigation that happens, they're really going to try to keep things confidential. That is a difficult line to toe because you've got to gather information as well. But to the extent that the immigrant or the employee has built up a relationship with certain individuals within their company and can try to develop some trust, that's what they're going to try to do, is try to keep things confidential. But that it's understandably difficult. These are difficult conversations, and it's a sensitive topic. So companies and outside consultants and investigators try to keep things sensitive and confidential to the extent possible. But things will need to be discovered during that process.
So one thing I want to make sure we get to before we finish up is really workplace romances, right? I mean, that happens a lot, and I think one of the things, Paula, you'd mentioned is really when we're talking about harassment, sexual harassment, is about welcome or wanted or unwelcome conduct in some type of way. So two folks end up getting into a relationship. What are some best practices of what they should do? And when that relationship ends, what are some best practices, what they should do.
Oh, it's already ended. It just started. So the first thing is you want to make sure your interactions with your coworkers, and you're right, people are messy. They're going to interact with each other in the workplace, and oftentimes romantically, is to make sure that you're having clear conversations about consent, about your intent. And it may sound sort of very, but it makes sense on the front end to be very clear that we're in this relationship, you're good, I'm good, assuming that you're both at the same level. If you're not at the same level, if you're talking about a manager and a subordinate, it becomes a little bit more difficult because what is perceived as consent may not actually be consent. Someone may not feel like they're able to say no to any advances. And so oftentimes when HR or EEO finds out about relationships that are your subordinate and manager, they will interview both parties to actually assess how it started and whether in fact it is consensual. And some of my clients and employers in general are saying to folks, you've now let us know about this information that you're dating. As soon as this ends, if it does, you have to also let us know so that we understand that the nature of the relationship has now changed and we can act essentially as such. But how you make this right is that you keep the workplace and you keep your romantic relationship elsewhere, so you're not interacting romantically at work. You're trying your best as you can to not sort of have those lines crossed within the workplace, even if you are in fact in a relationship, because it becomes challenging in a myriad of other ways, just having that be the situation as well.
That's exactly right. And to add on to what Paul is saying, you want to make sure if your company has a policy about relationships, if they have a relationship policy, follow that to the T to make sure that you're keeping everything above board. And to your question, Jason, about if things end, if the relationship ends, the moment it ends, if one of the two individuals says, I don't want to be in this relationship anymore, any sort of advances after that can be viewed as unwelcome advances. The moment it ends, if you were in a relationship one night at a text and someone sends the text that this is over, and then you go to work the next day and you're, trying to woo the person and bring her back or bring him back into your life, that can start to toe the line again as to being sexual harassment in the workplace, to where the employer or one of these different agencies has to get involved. It can be that fast, but that's why it's important to be open and honest with your communication and to try to keep things above board and be appropriate in how you handle your interactions with people at work.
So even with that, so let's say I'm listening today, I heard everything that you said, David, I heard everything you said, Paula, and I did none of those things. And you're in a relationship with somebody at work, and for whatever reason it ends, and one person still wishes the relationship to go on and one person doesn't. There are texts going back and forth. If I haven't told HR anybody about it to begin with, or later on, am I still covered? I mean, am I still entitled to the protections that are out there for people who are being harassed? Or because I feel like this is a type of the situation that we see a lot of folks in there, where they should have done these things, but they haven't done it, and then they're reluctant about coming forward because they just aren't sure, how they would be perceived, even though they are being harassed at this point.
So everyone is protected in the workplace from being sexually harassed. Like that, your policy, the laws protect you from that. Whether or not you've come forward or not, at the point in which for you it's unwanted and unwelcome, that's when you can trigger you to say, I want to file a complaint or to say that this has happened. And then an investigation has to happen. It's never, I say this and then off with the person's head, right? That's not how it works. There has to be due process for both parties. It needs to be fair for both parties in terms of questions being asked, information being gathered, and then a determination being made. What I think you were alluding to is potential false allegations too, right? Federally, there's less than 3% of allegations that are false. And so it may seem bigger, and I think there's a big fear now in terms of the workplace that people are like, oh my gosh, somebody might file something that's false against me and I might be found guilty. That's really not how it works. An investigation will generally come up with what has happened or that something did not happen in the way that is being alleged, unless there's proof. And on the flip side, that's what makes it really hard to prove generally, and why people may not want to come forward in terms of saying there's an allegation of sexual harassment. So as long as folks are feeling as if they have been egregious and there's been a law broken and they actually file and go do what they're supposed to do, usually the process works itself out. Now, there are times when it does not, and that I think is a very challenging piece of this. But I would say, to the extent that you know the policy, follow it as best as you can. And if you have not, and as soon as you find that there's a reason for you to want to exercise it, then follow it then. And speak and be truthful in all of your interactions so that you help to protect yourself within any investigation.
Yeah. And within these last 5 minutes, would either of you mind addressing, there's been a myriad of articles that have come out now that have basically men are saying that they don't want to mentor women in the workplace because of the Me Too movement. Can either of you talk about what's not right about that?
Yeah, well, I think that's an unintended consequence of this movement, and really an unfortunate reaction. And I think just an excuse that folks are making to, that's not the purpose of this movement. This is an issue that I think folks generally understand has been happening for years, that folks have been sexually harassed, and women specifically. And so for certain men at the executive level to withdraw and say, I've heard folks say, well, I don't even know if I can shake a woman's hand anymore. And I think that folks are being quite disingenuous when they're saying things like that. And so, I think you got to be honest with yourselves and have real conversations with people. And saying that you're not going to mentor someone just because there are now focuses on these issues. There are ways to mentor people that don't involve, necessarily going to dinner or a hotel or something for a conference with somebody. You can still, get to know them at the workplace and mentor them and have conversations in your office where you can develop that relationship regardless. So I think I would challenge those who think that mentoring people is really how these accusations came about. I don't think that's really the case.
So there's two things. The way you protect yourself from being accused of sexual harassment, one of those ways is to not sexually harass people.
Exactly.
Right? And so if the thought is that I have to not interact with people in order for me not to have those allegations, it means that probably there was something along the lines that you were doing, right, that you probably shouldn't have been doing. I think it really speaks to me about what the perception in the head is. These are not false allegations. These are actual allegations, right? The other thing is you want to realize that if you say, I'm only going to meet with men behind closed doors, I'm only going to interact with men in these ways, you are discriminating as well. So you put yourself in a line of fire in another way of discriminating against someone that's not sexual harassment, but it is gender discrimination, right? And so what you want to do is you want to treat everybody fairly. You want to interact with people authentically, assuming your authentic self is not a sexual harasser, right? And that's the hope that that's not the case. The bubble wrap theory in this is not one that's going to help us, and actually is going to push women back in the workplace, and that's an unintended consequence that I think is going to be very challenging to address, because there is fear out there, and the more that we have conversations about how to actually interact with people and not have to have it be sexually based, the better. And that's why doing these trainings and having conversations and talking is better than shutting your door, wrapping yourself in bubble wrap, never talking to anyone. That's not how we solve this.
Right, thank you. Well, I want to thank our guests for being here with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching Raising the Bar with the MBBA. To watch our other shows, you can visit mnn.org. Until next time, goodbye.